There you hear Todd Bowles. That was at the press conference on Saturday morning, the day after the Buccaneers preseason finale, Friday night against the Miami Dolphins. And two players for the Buccaneers will start on IR, and it'll be Rakim Jarrett and Chase Edmonds. So not much of a surprise there, but usually in years past, if you put a guy on the IR, he was done for the year, but that's not the case now. So these guys can return, and that's a good sign because I think those two guys, I don't know if we're necessarily expecting the Buccaneers to depend on them, but Zach, if you get to a point where that you need to go to those two guys, you'd rather have them than not have them.
I thought it was a very chestnut checkers move by Todd, and now given the guy's got to be a little bit banged up for it to be legitimate, and we know Chase has been in the bucket hat, obviously with Jarrett. Unfortunate, but almost like a blessing in disguise to see him get a little nicked up because now they're able to retain both those guys. And I mean, there's different positives to each one. With Chase, you just want to keep a veteran presence. You want to keep a fourth running back around where if, something happens, you'd rather him kind of come into the mix than have to rely on. And I like Bucky a lot, but he is a rookie. And right. Sean Tucker, he's an undrafted guy from last year who played 2 games and then disappeared the rest of the season. So I think that presence doesn't matter as much as it sits. But if there is an injury, you want to be able to have Chase jump on board and be a part of the mix. On Jarrett, that's a guy with a higher ceiling, and we were talking about how hard it was going to be to figure out what was going to happen with the receiver room, and we'll look more at the cuts as we kind of go through today. Obviously, the 4 o'clock deadline not too far off from when the roster has to be trimmed to its final point. Or tomorrow.
Yeah.
But they're still going to keep trimming.
Today, yeah. You would think it would trickle down.
And the receiver room is one that is pretty loaded with some guys. So Jarrett's one now that you don't have to worry about trying to keep versus not keep. Essentially, you open up 2 roster spots that you probably wouldn't have had if those guys were healthy.
Yeah, and you got to trim from 90 to 53, so they've already trimmed down 18 different guys. And we'll get into that in the 2 o'clock hour because we didn't want to necessarily break it. And no huge names as of now. So we'll get into that, and if we hear any more a little bit later on in the 2 o'clock hour. But we wanted to get back to...
Well, there was one big name.
What? Oh, yeah, we'll get to it. Wait till 2 o'clock. Wait till 2 o'clock.
I'm in a good mood now.
Yes.
We'll save the sadness
save
for
that.
2 o'clock.
But Todd also spoke about something that we got into at the beginning of the show today, and that was Liam Cohen and the rushing attack. So what does he think, and how much credit does Liam deserve?
Well, he gets a ton of credit. Obviously, Carberry and Picucci do as well. All the offensive coaches, because the receivers block as well. And again, it's early. It's preseason, but structurally, they're playing faster. They're getting up to the second level. We got to continue that as the season goes. But structurally, right now, everything in place. Liam's he's the big credit for it.
Yeah, and it's a step in a great direction on the OC side of things. But it takes a village, right? Like, it's not just Liam, just like it's not just Todd on the defensive side. Like, these guys are all kind of getting in the mix and helping out. And I think it was Scott Reynolds. I was listening to Peter Report's pod on after the game, and they were talking about how Ben Bredesen really gave a lot of credit to the rest of the coaching staff, too. Not to say that he took anything away from Liam Cohen, but it takes a village. And there's a lot going on there. It's tough for me to pick apart right now on offense and, find something I don't like. Whether it's Liam, whether it's his assistants, whether it's the players, whether it's the scheme. It all looks right. It looks good. Well, hopefully it kind of translates into week 1, but we have no reason to believe it won't right now.
Well, it's funny, too, because the 2 guys that he mentioned Kevin Carberry, the offensive line coach, who was very vocal in camp, and we articulated as much when he was getting Cody Malk that one day.
Oh, man.
And then also Brian Picucci, the assistant offensive line coach. So you love to see Coach Todd Bowles showing some love to some of these other coaches. And I think that's one thing that Todd Bowles learned from Bruce Arians is delegating the responsibilities to your assistant coaches and then let them do their thing. And that's what you're seeing here. And they're really flourishing right now. And it's exciting to see this offensive line take a step forward. And we talk a lot about, all right, Liam Cohen's here, new offensive coordinator. There's no offensive line coaches, too. So Harold Goodwin and those guys, they've moved on. And now you have a guy like Kevin Carberry and you have a guy like Brian Picucci in there. That's another thing, another step forward. And that's something that I heard from a couple of different people throughout training camp of the coaching on the offensive line is better. And that should not be understated. You already have Tristan Wirfs and Luke Gedeke, who got better last year, right? And now you bring in Graham Barton. You bring in a veteran like Bredesen. You're hoping Cody Mauch could take that step forward in year 2. That's something that cannot be overshadowed and needs to be talked about more. Is not just the improvement with the OC, but also the improvement with the offensive line coaches. And we know that there's tough decisions to be made, but especially at that wide receiver spot, they're in a much better spot than Carolina, who's just going to keep 4 guys and then hope that you drop a couple guys on waivers for them. Here's what Coach Todd Bowles said about that wideout position.
There's some decisions to be made. Got a good look at Cam last night for the first time. He did some really good things, running and catching with the football. Cody's been consistent all preseason. Miller's shown some things as well. So, those 3 guys really got some decisions to make there.
Yeah, and the guys he was talking about, Ryan Miller, who looked really, really good in the game on Friday night.
All preseason, really.
Preseason long. He catches that 1 touchdown, only 1 catch on 4 targets, but Cody Thompson as well. 7 catches out of 8 targets for 45 yards. He's got a great rapport with Kyle Trask. And then he mentioned Cam Johnson there. 3 catches on 5 targets, 12 yards. They love his speed. He could be a factor in the return game, if not the wideout position. It's a great problem to have if you're the Buccaneers.
It is. And again, that kind of is an area where Jarrett being on the IR to start and not being able to, be one of the guys taking up a slot or having to make that decision helps those kind of cats specifically. And again, I know we're going to kind of focus more on the Miami game because it was the most recent, but 2 of those guys, all 3 of them collectively through camp and preseason have flashed and have shown that they can do some good things both in the offense and in special teams. But, I think that that's a room where if you can keep as many of those guys as you're able to, it's going to benefit you as you move forward. And again, it'll be interesting to see how they're mixed in on special teams with the new kick rule, which is, I don't know, I'm probably not going to get too deep into that today. I know we have Greg Allman coming on Wednesday with us. He did like a deep dive into the kick rule. I don't really know how to feel about it, but I know those guys will be a part of how the Bucs handle it.
You got that right. We did see one other cut, but just a smaller name as well. Again, we'll get into that at 2 o'clock today. Also, Jake Camarda and Chase McLaughlin. Good to see Chase, after missing a kick in each one of the first 2 preseason games, have a perfect night on Friday against the Dolphins. But Jake Camarda, they brought in Nolan Cooney as a guy to kind of put some pressure onto Jake. They eventually cut Cooney on over the weekend. But just listen to Todd speak about Jake Camarda, and I think there's some improved play that needs to happen from the Buccaneers punter.
It's not an area I'm very happy with right now. Obviously, but Jake has to punt it better. He had 2 weeks in a row where he didn't punt well. Chase came back around. We'll see about the punting situation or whether adding somebody to the practice squad, but we definitely got to get better in that area.
That was probably one of the more inflammatory things that Todd Bowles has said during training camp. And it, obviously inflammatory is probably a little bit of a strong word, but that just shows you.
I felt it.
He felt it. Zach felt it.
I felt it.
Felt it in his plums. And
it was there.
Jake's got to pick it up. He's got to pick it up. Now we've seen that he can do the job and he can be a successful punter in this league, but you just wonder a little bit of a lapse of focus. Todd Bowles and the rest of the crew is kind of looking around like, all right, Jake, time to step it up. I have faith that he's going to turn it around, but early, what he's been able to do in preseason so far, not good enough.
Yeah, I mean, I would say for me, just generally speaking about football games, I think the thing we undervalue the most that we should talk about more is field position. And a lot of that obviously is reliant on your ability to tackle with special teams, but more so what your punter's doing in those positions. I mean, and the Bucs have had some years, even where they were successful, where they weren't great at the field position side of the game. And Jake Camarda came in, and it seemed like he kind of fixed some of that. He was able to kind of help them along the way. But that, because that's an aspect of the game, like we're not paying attention to as much. The casual fan doesn't see as much. They're just like, oh, the offense is supposed to score on the defense. The defense is supposed to stop them. Well, it's a lot easier to slow down an offense that starts at the 5 than one that starts at the 25 or the 35. So, yeah, I get, and we know how Todd Bowles is. We know that he's very into the nitty gritty in terms of we need the fundamentals to be on the floor level in a good place. Again, I'm not worried about Camarda right now, but I do find it very interesting that Todd was, a little poke.
He was
poke
vocal.
action
Yeah,
there.
he was vocal about it.
A little poke action on him.
He was certainly vocal about that. Also, when you look at some of the guys that have really stepped up, look at Logan Hall and Luke Gedeke. Here's what Todd Bowles had to say about those two guys.
Both very tough, and they have the same things they need to do to get better. When they both use their hands, they're very, very good football players. Logan has length. Luke has length and toughness. They both have toughness. When they try to brawl and just use their bodies, they get in trouble technically. When they use their hands, they're very hard to stop.
Yeah, and obviously we talked about Luke a little bit in the first segment today and just, where he's at now, where he's come from, how reliable he's become. I think we've shown a lot of love to Luke, rightfully so. I do want to talk about Logan Hall a little bit. And we still do, not today, but we still do get texts pretty often, Jay, about Logan Hall and people kind of being disappointed in him, to put it lightly. I think he looked good in that final preseason game against Miami. I thought he showed up. He's been around the ball a lot when he is on the field, and sometimes, look, he's not going to be Vita Vea. It's like, that's just not who he is. He's not going to be the kind of guy that flashes off the paper statistically, but he's a guy similar, and you've done a great job connecting the dots, that will be maybe the next Will Golston for this team. And I think that's a good thing. I think if he can become that, especially knowing the other monsters on this defensive line, I'm okay with what Logan Hall's become and where he's at currently.
All right, we were going to wait to talk about some of the cuts, but we got to talk about this one because it is breaking news right here on Jay and Zach on 95.3 WDAE. And AM 620, Ian Rappaport at Rap Sheet on Twitter has confirmed that the Buccaneers have released veteran wide receiver Sterling Shepard. The 31-year-old signed with hopes of rekindling his rapport with old teammate Baker Mayfield. It may still happen. The team is holding a practice spot for him, which I think is a cool thing. And you do that with the hope and, that if you do need him, that he'll be there. And I think it's just as much of him being banged up because as it is some of these young guys really taking that step forward and liking what you've seen. You already have 4 guys locked in. You have your 4 locked in, but you got to believe that they like what they see from Cam. They like what they've seen from Thompson. And they like what they've seen from a guy like Ryan Miller, too. There's a lot of different contributions for this team. And Sterling Shepard, he's not going to play special teams, and he's not 100%. You still have the relationship with Baker Mayfield. This doesn't come as a surprise here, but it is kind of a finality when it comes to, all right, well, he's not starting, with this team. He's not going to be on that roster week 1.
Yeah, and there's certainly a few different aspects of this, but bottom line is, if you're already a fringe guy on the roster and you're not healthy, you're not making the team.
Right.
And we talked about this last week, Jay. Would it be surprising to see 2 veterans go, and Chase Edmonds and Sterling Shepard? Chase, obviously, they're keeping around with that IR spot. You get 2 of them. Jarrett's getting the other one. And Sterling has been banged up, but I think that they're just in a place in that wide receiver room where, you don't need the veteran presence because you have Mike Evans, you have Chris Godwin. You don't need chemistry with Baker because we saw that Mike had that last year. We've seen him create that with a guy like Jalen McMillan already this camp. So the things that you would point to when it comes to Sterling Shepard and say, okay, this might help him get a spot on the roster. Well, even in that capacity, he's the 3rd guy on the list in each of those categories. So it's tough. I liked the signing when they brought him in. I thought the idea was in the right place. I'm appreciative that he was able to come on board and kind of be a part of this team in some capacity. And the other thing that he did, it seemed like in practice that they didn't use the other receivers as much for, was when they did gadget plays and they were running receivers out of the backfield or end arounds. Sterling seemed to be the guy that they were using. But again, best ability is availability, and he didn't have that really throughout the preseason or training camp. So I wouldn't say I'm shocked. I would say that, again, just because things don't work out, it doesn't mean that it was the wrong decision when you did it. I always use Jameis Winston as the example. I still think he was the right guy to take first overall, even though that tenure obviously didn't work out here in a much lesser capacity, obviously. I feel the same way about Sterling Shepard coming aboard just to kind of be let go.
And let's not forget, too, he only played 10 games in 21 and 22 combined. And then last year in the 2023 season, he suited up for 15 games, but he only caught 10 passes for 57 yards and a touchdown. So for a guy, you're trying to catch maybe lightning in a bottle and maybe get a year from him. But I think this was the ultimate kind of safety net. If Trey Palmer didn't take that step forward, if Jalen McMillan wasn't ready, if none of these other young receivers, whether it's Rakim Jarrett at the time, and looking at the guys that we just mentioned, Thompson and Miller and Cam Johnson, if none of those guys stepped forward and there was egregious errors across the line with those guys, then you would look at Sterling Shepard as, man, we got to find a way to get him in this rotation of the receivers. But it hasn't been like that in training camp. Sterling Shepard ended up having a really nice rapport with Kyle Trask early on in camp. Then Thompson became that guy with Kyle when Sterling started getting banged up. And you really didn't get to a point of like, wow, they really need Sterling Shepard. He's a great guy, pro's pro, definitely never going to take anything away from your team, but we'll see what his future holds. But I wouldn't be very surprised if his not just time with the Buccaneers, but his career in the NFL is done.
And I wonder how
he was already on the couch. Like, he was on the couch.
Yeah, he could go back. I mean, look, there's places that could still use him. Carolina, right?
He ain't going.
I mean, the Panthers. Sterling Shepard could be wide receiver 3 if he left today to go there.
He might be
wide receiver
receiver 1.
Yeah, don't get me started. However, what I will say, and I want to ask you this kind of, I wonder how much of how the Bucs have handled the receiver room, both from the draft until now, has been indicative of what happened with Russell Gage last year, because they were really banking on him to be a big part of this offense, come back from injury. It just wasted money. Unfortunately, the guy just couldn't stay healthy, and that's, I don't blame him for that. I don't blame the Bucs for, not foreseeing him being hurt the entirety of 2 seasons, and just really a sad story, and that does happen. That's just bad luck. However, after that, they didn't have a lot of places to turn. Trey Palmer did some nice things, and they had some other receivers in the mix. But you look at this year, they bring in Jalen McMillan. They bring in Jared again. They have the other 2 youngsters and 3 youngsters that we've been talking about. And then they're like, let's add a Sterling Shepard. It felt like the Bucs were more willing to really hedge their bets with what I consider good options in the wide receiver room behind Mike and Chris. And I wonder how much of what happened with Russell last year has to do with that.
The numbers game, right? Think about that. They went from, I think what the Buccaneers looked at and they said, hey, we were so good when we had 3 legit receivers, right? With Godwin, with Evans, and with Antonio Brown. Let's try to get another, a third guy like that. But what they didn't take into account was that second season when Godwin got banged up and Antonio Brown left, like, it wasn't the same, right? So what they've done as far as adjusting to how they constructed their roster, they looked at it as, hey, we have 2 top-tier receivers.
Yep.
Let's attack the third spot with 2 guys.
Yep.
Palmer and McMillan. And then there's another tier of receivers that we can take 5 guys for 2 or 3 spots. And I think that helps in so many ways, because if you have injuries, if you have guys that underperform, if you have guys on the back end that end up playing better like we have in this situation, I think that's a much smarter way to attack the position rather than going, let's go try to get a third one. Because in essence, that's what they try to do with Russell Gage. He was wide receiver 3, but they wanted him to be like that third 100%. Tier, and then everybody else was a drop-off.
All we talked about was how many dynamic things Russell was going to do in this offense.
Right, but then look back when the Buccaneers won the Super Bowl in 2020. Yes, you had your contributions from Chris Godwin and Mike Evans and Antonio Brown. But let's not forget, huge third down catch against the Saints from Tyler Johnson. Huge catch in the NFC Championship game for Scotty Miller. Hell, he rode that thing the rest of his freaking career. He's still playing
Scott now, though.
I don't care. He's still
Scott Miller in Pittsburgh.
He
goes by Scott in the Steel
riding
City.
The coattails of that one catch in Green Bay. But you need contributions from different guys if you're going to be successful and you're going to have a long postseason run.
Hey, speaking, since you brought up those names, where my Tyler Johnson stands at. I know y'all are still out there. You're like cockroaches. You just wouldn't let it go. You wouldn't die. The Tyler Johnson...
Hockey or
football.
Or
but
basketball?
Yeah, it works for both. I think he's still very beloved on the hockey side of things.
Definitely.
TJ will always be a big fan favorite in terms of the hockey side.
We love you.
But there were people that swore Tyler Johnson was like the 3rd best option for the Bucs.
He had
every year after he wasn't even here anymore.
Yeah.
What are you going to say? He said he had some big catches. He also had trouble holding on to the football.
He did. But
so he wasn't consistently making the big catches.
His last college game,
and we saw
his last college game for Minnesota was phenomenal. So it was like, oh, this is great. Keep this guy here. But it went down.
I'm not a hater.
Bad. Wait, no, I'm not your hater. But there was people that had these lofty
love
goals.
For Tyler Johnson.
Yeah, it was weird.
Sheesh, man.
Weirdly placed love for him. All right, we're going to hit this break. When we come back on the other side, we're going to talk all things Rays with our guy, Mark Topkin. They dropped 2 of 3 to the Dodgers in L.A., but one young player certainly stood out. Who is that? We'll tell you when we return. Mark Topkin joins us. Jay and Zach, 95.3 WDAE and AM 620, your home of the Tampa Bay Rays.